In the late 4th century, the Eurasian continent was anchored by two colossal pillars of stability. In the west, the Roman Empire. In the east, the Gupta Empire. Between them, they governed a massive portion of the world's population. The Gupta Empire had reached a peak of academic progress. Scholars like Aryabhata were calculating the value of pi to 4 decimal places and proposing that the Earth rotated on its own axis, theories that would not gain traction in Europe for centuries. This gold coin highlights the emperor's identity as a musician, depicting him playing a stringed vina. It serves as evidence of a dynasty that prioritized artistic patronage as a core pillar of royal authority. Their physical engineering was equally precise. The iron pillar of Delhi, forged during this era, stands as proof of their metallurgical skill. It contains a high phosphorus layer that has prevented it from rusting for over 1,500 years. Classical civilization had reached a level of centralized knowledge and economic integration that its citizens believed to be permanent. Then, the borders ruptured. A highly mobile force of nomadic horse archers swept in from the Eurasian steppe, striking with a speed and ferocity that existing militaries were entirely unprepared for. The assault happened simultaneously on both ends of the continent. In the west, Attila the Hun began dismantling the Roman frontier. In the east, groups known as the Kittites and the Alchon Huns struck the Gupta Empire. To the Romans and the Guptas, these invaders seemingly materialized out of a vacuum. They left no written records of their own, leaving scholars puzzled about their true origins for centuries. Contemporary observers often described the invaders as a supernatural elemental force. To those living through the collapse, the Huns appeared as a scourge of God, a uniform disaster sent to dismantle their world. It took modern genetics to finally trace their path. By sequencing the DNA of 370 ancient individuals buried across Eurasia, researchers recently isolated the genetic signatures of the highest elite among Attila's Huns. The highest echelons of the Hunnic leadership carried identical by descent genetic links to the Xiongnu, a massive nomadic confederation that had dominated the Mongolian steppe before collapsing around 100 CE, nearly 3 centuries earlier. This genetic data indicates a slow, western-moving progression that lasted for generations before the Huns finally reached the borders of Rome. As these descendants of the Xiongnu moved, they intermarried. They absorbed and mixed with other nomadic populations they encountered along the way, such as the Sarmatians and the Alans. The DNA reveals a diverse population, a patchwork of ancestries bound together by the marriage practices of a nomadic elite. Eventually, this massive wave of migrating populations diverged. One branch pressed further into Europe's Carpathian basin. Another branch turned south, aiming directly at the Indian subcontinent. On the Indian front, the Gupta Empire mounted a fierce resistance. Emperor Skandagupta successfully fought back the first major wave of Hunna attacks, temporarily stabilizing the northern borders. The Guptas countered the intense mobility of the steppe nomads with their own military innovations. They integrated heavy armored cavalry alongside their traditional formidable formations of war elephants to break the Hunnic charges. But the pressure was relentless. By the year 500 CE, new waves of Alchon Huns, led by commanders Toramana and Mihirakula, completely broke through the northwest defenses and flooded into the interior. The sheer cost of defending a massive frontier against such high mobility proved ruinous. By the time the defenses broke, decades of constant mobilization had already exhausted the empire's financial reserves. Gupta Praster relied on a vast trade network funneling silk, ivory, and pepper from Indian urban centers to the markets of the Roman Empire. When the Alchon Huns occupied the northwest, they physically severed these routes, dismantling the primary economic engine of the state. The physical destruction followed swiftly. Great urban centers and massive monastic universities, the jewels of the empire, were violently targeted and burned to the ground. Nalanda, a vast complex of learning that housed thousands of scholars, was severely damaged, and cities like Taxila were left in ruins. Without central revenue and with their cultural institutions crippled, the unified administration collapsed. The 300-year golden age of the Gupta Empire permanently fractured, dividing northern India into a collection of smaller, localized regional kingdoms. The invasion triggered a massive cultural regression. It exposed a harsh reality of human civilization. centuries of centralized institutional knowledge, wealth, and stability can be erased in a matter of a few generations. Zooming out, the macro timeline of the 5th century reveals a stunning geopolitical collapse. The classical world's two greatest empires, separated by thousands of miles, fell to their knees simultaneously. The Scourge of God in Europe and the White Huns in India were not isolated disasters. They were branches of the exact same migration, bound by the shared genetic lineage of the ancient Xiongnu. A localized political collapse on the Mongolian steppes centuries earlier created an outward pressure that rippled across the world. That pressure built as it moved west, eventually dictating the fate of empires at the far edges of the continent. The story of the Huns demonstrates the deep connectivity of the ancient world. It shows how a single wave of migration could traverse a continent, rewriting the geopolitical destiny of every empire in its